Let your eyes move slowly, as if your gaze itself were a dim beam. From the compact heart of the visitor, a soft halo opens, grainy and delicate, and a fine brightness leans sunward like a pencil line drawn on dark glass. It isn't a shout, it's a whisper, made of light. You can trace it without hurry, see where the glow thickens near the core, then thins into a pale filament that seems to prefer the star. Hold it there. Breathe with it. The scene is quiet and careful, balanced on subtle shades rather than drama. Now let the same eyes cross to a second frame. The nucleus sits in the same calm, but the composition has shifted. The fine line is no longer forward. Instead, the long brightness flows the other way, a classic tail easing from the halo and stretching into cool distance. It is familiar, almost textbook, yet the memory of the first image lingers, and that contrast is what matters. The light is teaching us by comparison. I stay with the halo. This is where patience pays interest. Around that small core, scattered sunlight blooms in different textures, a tight inner glow, a mottled skirt, a faint veil. In the first frame, the veil leans into the glare. In the second, it yields and streams away. Nothing about the halo looks hurried. Nothing looks theatrical. The sky is doing what it often does, changing slowly while we're not watching, and the camera simply caught it mid-sentence. You may notice how the brightest part clings to the center, then rolls gently outward, how corners of darkness anchor the field, how the edge of the tail looks feathered instead of sharp. Light can make kindness out of physics. It shows where dust is dense, where gas is thin, where the path of tiny grains is tugged by sunlight's push. In one quiet moment, the forward sheen feels almost like a glow caught in a headlamp. In the next, the display aligns with the rule most of us learned. Tails lean away. There's a temptation to turn this into a verdict, to declare that one image is natural and the other is strange. We don't need to do that tonight. Two frames are two chapters of the same sentence, and sentences can curve. Perspective can lean on us. Composition can evolve. Even the way our eyes prefer contrast can trick us into seeing certainty where there is only gentle drift. I imagine the halo breathing at an even rate, the tail listening, the field quietly accepting both arrangements of light. Between these frames is a timeline you cannot see but can sense, the way a room feels different after someone opens a window. In that unseen span, heat deepens, surfaces wake, and dust gains a little courage. 1,000 small pushes add up to a different sketch. Compare long enough, and you'll find the rhyme. The first image carries a forward gleam. The second replies with a soft, obedient stream. The halo keeps its composure through both. What matters here is not a label, but attention. It isn't enough to glance and nod. Let your gaze rest on the way the tail thickens near the base, the way brightness is distributed like watercolor, more pigment close in, more paper peeking through far out. Notice that the field stars stay in different pins of light. The visitor alone wears a garment that moves. Under a gentle stare, the change feels less like a flip and more like a settling, as if the object remembered an older pattern and returned to it without fuss. I keep returning to the core because the core is where the story gathers itself, and because restraint is a kind of truth-telling in pictures like these. If we were to compose a working theory from nothing but what the light suggests, we might say that grains were once released in a way that favoured the sunward side, and later the mix shifted and the light shifted too. But we would hold that thought loosely, accepting that two calm images can be generous without being decisive, and understanding that the sky often asks us to collect more nights before we claim to understand. There is space here for wonder that doesn't hurry toward the loudest door. The two frames are not rivals, they are a pair. They sit in the dark like twin lanterns on a long porch, showing us that appearances can lean one way and then the other, that a halo can remain serene while the line it feeds chooses a new direction, that learning can be gentle when light is allowed to speak at its own volume. And somewhere in that patience is the part that helps people sleep, the sense that it's possible to watch closely without being pulled into noise. We will come to mechanisms and tests as the night unfolds. For now, let this be an act of careful seeing, a halo, a line, a change, a lesson written in brightness gradients and quiet edges. The first frame's forward gleam, the second frame's faithful tale, and between them, a soft promise that more watching will make the pattern clearer. Because in a universe this large, it's the discipline of slow comparison that turns pictures into knowledge. And tonight, we begin by learning how to look. The green of the halo lightens in the mind, thinning toward a cooler blue as the eyes close a little, and the two frames blend softly together. A faint relay clicks in the dark, and I let the room's rhythm guide me. The filter wheel turns with a quiet step, the shutter opens like a soft breath, and the detector begins its low hum, counting light as if counting heartbeats. This is how we listen to comets. We place the instrument's metronome beside the sky and hear what the tail is trying to say. With each exposure, the signal settles. Dust reflects sunlight in a steady tone, broad and warm. Gas glows in sharper lines, higher notes set by molecules that fluoresce under the sun's energy. Most nights, the song resolves the same way. The dust tail leans away from the sun because sunlight pushes on tiny grains, and that push, though gentle, has measure and tempo. The ion, tail points even straighter from the sun, a clean line carried down the solar wind like a sustained note along a wire. The instrument doesn't care for poetry. It reports counts, angles, phase, and noise. Yet, if you stand here long enough, the physics begins to sound like music anyway. Radiation pressure is a persistent beat on small grains. Gravity lays down a slower bass line. The solar wind adds a high whispering hiss that pulls ions outward. Change the grain size and the timbre shifts. Change the viewing angle and your ear moves in the hall. Every now and then a forward glow appears, like a tone arriving early. You see a sunward spike and think it breaks the rules. The detector reminds us it does not. Anti-tails are old news to patience. When Earth slides into the comet's orbital plane, dust that trails along that plane can project as a sunward feature, the way an echo can seem to come from the wrong wall in a big room. The classic cases hum through the literature. R. N. Roland in 1957, Lulin in 2009, displays that turned heads and then yielded to geometry's steady meter. I like to hold 3 handrails while the graphs render. First, dust versus gas. 2 sections of the same orchestra, one broadband, one line-rich. Second, the phase angle, which is the angle between sun, comet, and us. Forward scattering near small phase can amplify the brightness we see on the sunward side, as if a quiet instrument suddenly sits closer to your chair. Third, the beta parameter, a tidy ratio that tells how hard light presses on a grain compared to gravity's pull. Small grains have a higher beta and answer more quickly to the sun's steady push. The beat stays gentle and the language stays kind. We rarely need sharp words to describe tails. Dust grains leave the nucleus with modest speeds, drift outward, and their paths bend as if a conductor's hand were guiding them toward the anti-solar direction. Ions, stripped and carried by magnetic fields embedded in the solar wind, arrange themselves into that familiar blue spear, obedient to a different section of the score. Change the heliocentric distance, and the amplitude rises or falls. Approach the sun and the piece crescendos. Recede and it quiets. A forward gleam can tempt us to call the performance unusual, but the instrument's cadence keeps me honest. Exposure after exposure, the shapes evolve with the dials we expect. The nearer the sun, the richer the gas notes. The rotation of the nucleus modulates jets like a rotating speaker, raising and lowering intensity as faces come into light. When the forward feature fades and the anti-solar tail grows, it's often because the scattering geometry changed or the dust size distribution shifted, and so the mix we hear moved from one register to another. Underneath, momentum is counting beats. Each grain that leaves carries away a small impulse, and the nucleus feels the opposite tug. If the ejection is lopsided, the measure includes a slight drift, non-gravitational acceleration that careful astrometry can detect. Often, though, the orchestra is large and the parts cancel, and the result for the path is a near-perfect legato along gravity's line with only the faintest deviation. The detector hears that too, in position residuals and timing. Consider the forward scattering itself. At certain phase angles, especially small ones, light favors us on the sunward side because tiny grains act like a choir facing the lamp. They sing louder toward the source and toward us when we stand near that line. This does not require defiance. It requires only a configuration in which angles and grain sizes agree to emphasize a particular chord of brightness, which then relaxes as geometry changes, just as any hall sounds different when you move 3 rows back. The smoothest lesson is that tails learn the sun the way a musician learns a tempo, by repetition until the reflex holds. Dust learns to lean. Ions learn to arrow out. Our cameras learn to expect both, and to expect the little exceptions that prove the pattern. That's why anti-tails no longer shock observers. They are part of the repertoire, impressive to see, restful to explain. If a forward feature lingers long past favorable geometry, or brightens in a way that refuses the phase angle story, the instrument will keep the counts honest and make us ask better questions. I stand by the console and let the numbers flow. There's a comfort in the way the noise averages out, in the way the signal rises above it as integration stacks like steady drum strokes. A long, single sentence forms as the night matures, describing how radiation pressure sorts grains by size and how a slow rotation modulates jet directions, each clause adding a little weight until even an anxious mind accepts that these tails are obeying rules that have been rehearsed for eons, and that our job is mostly to listen with care rather than to improvise explanations that the score does not require. What emerges gently is a method. Trust the cadence, check the phase, compare dust and gas, and look for persistence that survives a change of angle. If the tone changes with geometry, you are hearing the hall. if it persists through geometry, you may be hearing the instrument. Most of the time, it's the hall. And most of the time, this is satisfying, because the universe keeps time with a generous hand, and we sleep better when the beat we're tracking tonight belongs to a familiar song. The shutter closes with a small, certain click. What actually changed between those two calm pictures? Only the route the dust preferred, and it learned that route slowly. The unhurried turn is the small story here, the kind that takes weeks to finish its sentence, the kind that asks us to walk beside it rather than chase. From one night to the next, the forward gleam doesn't vanish. It thins. Then it thins again. Nearby, the long, obedient streamer grows a little more sure of itself, finding the reliable road away from the sun. Nothing snaps. Nothing breaks ranks. It feels like a traveller easing off a side street and merging onto a broad, familiar highway, indicator blinking, pace steady, eyes on the lane. You can picture the surface as a map, not a flat one, but a rugged terrain with pockets and ledges. When one patch faces the light, it wakes and releases grains. When it rotates away, it rests. Small changes in which regions face the day can tilt the balance of directions those grains take, and over many turns, a dominant route appears. A few bright nights later, that route is the one we notice most. The unhurried turn has no fuss in it, because rotation loves routine. Composition can nudge the route too. Early in the approach, the stuff that releases easily tends to speak first, lifting tiny grains that behave like eager day hikers, quick to start, quick to scatter. Later, tougher ice and mixed dust take over, pushing out slower, slightly heavier travellers who keep to the main road and feel the sun's outward shove more honestly. Forward sparkle softens, and the familiar away-leaning path becomes the highway of choice. This, too, is a patient rerouting rather than a sudden detour. Geometry has a habit of pretending to be change, and we're fair to ask whether a point of view wrote most of this story. As Earth moves, angles shift, and the same stream can appear to lean where it didn't before. Yet, there is a texture to true turning that projection can't counterfeit. The base of the feature reshapes. The core's skirt redistributes. Brightness gradients sketch new contours near the source. Layered images across many nights show those local adjustments, not just a sliding silhouette. And that is why the unhurried turn feels earned by the object itself. How does the turn look from the traveller's point of view? Grains that once found quick routes toward the sun are now less favoured. Fresh grains, born from warmer, deeper places, join the outward caravan and fall into step with the general flow. The whole scene acts like a soft migration, where the camp that once hugged the interior track shifts its tents to the outer path, and the trail markers, though faint, begin to line up in a more orderly chain. The halo keeps its poise through all of it. Is there any rush hidden beneath the calm? Our measurements answer with patience. The position of the traveller relative to the charted path stays within the confidence we expect from gravity's guidance. If subtle pushes exist, they are either small or balanced, the way hikers on both sides of a trail can keep a group centered without ever speaking. That balance lets us trust the view, a journey still ruled by the large map, with local foot traffic deciding which shoulder of the road gets more dust at dusk. There is a kindness in how the sky offers such lessons. It doesn't drop a mystery on us and run. It lets us collect a sequence, to see change accumulate like miles, to watch a preference form in public. Over several evenings, a pattern that once looked like a brief flourish resolves into an itinerary. A soft forward spur dwindles to a memory, while the long road outward gathers travellers by the hour. The unhurried turn, once named, becomes the lens through which each new image reads more clearly. You and I can rest in this rhythm because it privileges time over drama. Each session adds a small paragraph to the logbook, a little less glow in the sunward spur, a little more length in the outward plume, a slight thickening close to the core where fresh departures join the stream. Somewhere in that logbook, a long, quiet sentence forms, and it is the sentence of many natural journeys. Begin with whatever wakes first, adjust as conditions change, and keep to the main road when it offers the safest passage. If we wanted to test our travel story, we'd do what travelers always do: check landmarks from different angles, ask whether the mile markers line up no matter where we stand, and note whether the caravan keeps schedule even when the weather shifts. Multiple nights give us parallax on the experience. Filters separate dust from gas. Gentle polar tricks reveal how grains scatter along their routes. Piece by piece, the itinerary survives every check, and the confidence to call it an unhurried turn grows without needing to raise a voice. Some will wonder if a hidden guide is steering, if a hand beyond heat and sunlight has signaled the group to change lanes. The bar for that kind of tale is rightly high, because extraordinary road signs must be seen by many travellers at once, and must not depend on our angle at the overlook. Persistent acceleration that shrugs off the big map, a rhythm of discrete course corrections, or a chemistry that reads like machined alloy would set such a story apart. What we have, for now, is a measured drift that fits the old atlas, a turn any patient caravan might make as hills and daylight slowly revise the plan. In time, a long path writes calm into the body. You feel it when you watch the images in sequence. A settling in the shoulders, a slower blink, a sense that the object is not rushing toward a cliff, but walking along a broad ridge, taking the easiest contour as the season suggests. And there is one long comfort woven through that feeling, a spacious breath that admits how rivers, winds, crowds, and comets all follow the same kindness of terrain, letting gradient and habit carve a route that looks inevitable only after we've walked it with them for a while. A stillness arrives now, a lull at the edge of the monitors. Faint fans, a low room hum, an occasional click as a drive parks and wakes. I let the lights dim in my head and listen to the night pretend to be wider than it is. The traveller moves on without us for a minute. Distant air settles. A chair sighs. The road keeps going, unmarked and friendly, through the dark where numbers are sleeping, and every mile of it is patient. July 21st, 2025, 03:12 UTC. A single frame arrives like a postcard, stamped with the sun's direction and the comet's small arrow of motion. I hold it at arm's length in the mind. The scene looks simple, but geometry is a quiet trickster. What we see on the sky is not the object itself. It is the object pressed flat against the page, the way a shawl looks different when it's draped across a chair than when it's folded on a shelf. August becomes September, and new postcards gather along the console. Each bears the same sender, each stamped with a slightly different angle between sun, earth, and traveller. As our planet moves along its own path, the whole arrangement tilts, and the shadow lines we draw to orient ourselves slide across the field. The drape changes without the cloth itself changing. What looked like a forward tuft can be a fold, suddenly seen edge on. What looked like a long streamer can be the same fabric seen broadside, revealing its length at last. Projection is the name for this kindness. We take a three-dimensional flow, the gas and dust streaming around the nucleus, and project it onto a two-dimensional sky. The depth collapses. Perspective compresses. Lines that were separate overlap, and structures that were thin become apparent simply because the drape now catches the light differently from where we stand. The anti-tail phenomenon lives here. When Earth crosses the comet's orbital plane, particles spread along that plane can sketch a sunward spike, a neat pleat in the cloth that only appears when we sight along the seam. To test whether we're being fooled by the fold, we mark the postcards with guides. One line points to the sun. Another marks the comet's instantaneous motion. A third shows the line of nodes, where its orbital plane meets ours. When the sunward feature aligns with the orbital plane and brightens during the crossing, geometry is likely doing the heavy lifting. When the feature clings to the same direction, despite the plane sliding away beneath our feet, the cloth itself is stitched that way, not merely draped. Color helps too. Gas and dust differ in hue and in how they respond to the solar wind. If the forward gleam shows the signature of dust and brightens under phase angles that favor forward scattering, the pleat belongs to the fabric's weave. If a narrow blue ion spear stares sunward against expectation and laughs at angle changes, that is a different conversation. Most nights, dust behaves like dust, and ions like ions. The drape obeys its tailor. There are classic tools for this sewing room. Synchrones and syndines, curves that track when grains were released and how strongly sunlight pushes them, can be sketched over the postcards to see which pleats are merely the expected falls of the cloth. Vector tomography, a grand word for using. Many views to reconstruct the shape. Lets us imagine lifting the drape, peeking at how it hangs in space, and then laying it flat again to compare. With enough angles, the trick of the fold loses power. Even near the core, the fabric metaphor holds. A genuine change in emission direction tugs the hem differently. The innermost halo thickens on a new side. The base of a feature moves its attachment point. A pure projection effect, by contrast, slides apparent structures across the page, while the stitching at the center stays steady. By layering the postcards and blinking between them, we see whether the seam itself has shifted, or only the way we view the cloth. When the seam moves, we suspect changes on the surface. When it doesn't, we credit geometry and breathe easier. The phase angle, the angle Sun, Comet, Earth, acts like the light over a work table. At small phase, forward scattering can brighten the sunward side, much as a textured fabric sparkles when you stand near the lamp. At larger phase, that sparkle softens, and the anti-solar tail dominates the view. If the sunward flash appears just as the lamp angle favors it and fades as the lamp swings, we chalk the flourish up to the studio lighting, not a new weave. This kind of check doesn't demand drama. It rewards patience with postcards annotated in pencil. None of this calls the object ordinary in a dismissive sense. Ordinary in the sky often means deeply instructive. Watching geometry play its gentle games teaches us which signs not to chase. It trains a useful skepticism that is closer to kindness than doubt, the sort that knows folds and hems can masquerade as seams. When a feature resists all these geometric explanations, when the drape refuses to look different as we walk around the chair, then we lean in and ask for more careful tailoring notes from nature. Until then, the quiet craft of projection earns our respect. September 24, 2025, 04:06 UTC. Another postcard. The forward pleat thinner now, the anti-solar fall more confident. The overlaid lines, sun vector, motion arrow, orbital plane, sit in new places relative to one another, and the fabric's look matches the new lighting. I read this like a letter from an old friend. Still them, still their handwriting, only the paper and angle changing. There is a long comfort in that consistency, a sense that the drape is honest about what it is and how it hangs. When we plot the object's positions with high precision astrometry across these dates, the path follows gravity's neat hem. If tiny jets push, they do so in ways that cancel across the rotation, or in amounts too small to pull the cloth off its line. The postcards, for all their artistry, agree with the ledger. And in that agreement, we learn to separate stitch from style, structure from appearance, the seam of cause from the play of display, which is the very heart of reading the sky without letting it read us. The thought stretches out, unhurried, through the late part of the night, and in it is the recognition that a great deal of supposed strangeness in astronomy turns out to be the way perspective gathers depth and presses it flat, just as a patterned scarf can look entirely new when the fold changes, although no thread has moved at all, and that this recognition frees our attention for the few cases where the seam truly does shift and the cloth reveals a different cut than we expected. October edges closer, the postcards stack. We keep the overlays tidy and the pencils sharp. If a real pivot comes, we'll see the stitch pull and the hem rehang. If it's geometry, we'll watch the drape perform its quiet, honest illusions and smile at the craft. At 04:12 UTC, I set the time mark and close the album. The room is a hush of small machines. Fans lean into the background, the spectrograph lets a tiny relay tick, and somewhere inside the dome, a bearing sighs, like a low drum brushed with a fingertip. This is the key for tonight. We listen first. We let the comet's behavior arrive as sound in the mind, soft, repeated, almost metronomic, and then we translate it into motion. A jet is a whisper of gas and dust leaving the surface. It doesn't need to be loud to be sure. Each molecule that slips away carries a little push, and the nucleus answers with an equal opposite reply, the way a drumskin answers a tap. You cannot see the tap directly, not from here, but you can hear the effect by counting where the object should be, against where it is, letting tiny timing offsets form a rhythm. If the beats drift, the push is uneven. If the beats stay true, either the pushes cancel or they are too slight to matter. On many comets, the rhythm wanders. Astronomers fold that drift into their ledgers as non-gravitational terms, small corrections that admit the music is not purely gravity's baseline. It's ordinary. Ice warms, gas flows. The nucleus recoils as if a muted symbol were brushed again and again. The path bends gently, and we score that bend into the chart with little coefficients that tell other listeners how the song went this season. With this visitor, the ledger remains quiet. The timing marks land where gravity says they should, within the noise that instruments and atmosphere add to every performance. If there are extra beats, they blend into the room tone. That tells me two kind possibilities first. Either the object is massive enough that its answers to each tap barely move the drumhead, or the taps are arranged around the surface in a way that their effects cancel, like a quartet playing the same soft note from four corners, so the air shivers, but the chair does not. You can imagine how that would happen without any flourish. The nucleus spins. Sunlight warms one face, then another. Patches vent when they wake and rest when they sleep. If those patches are fairly distributed, their pushes average to nearly nothing over a full turn, and the long path keeps its beat. The tail still changes, because tails are about what leaves, not about how far the drum shifts under the hand. The jet pattern still breathes, because sunlight has its own tempo, but the center holds its place in the score. Momentum is the simplest percussionist in the ensemble. Thrust equals mass flow, rate times exhaust speed. A neat line that a first-year student could hum while packing a telescope case. The exhaust speed depends on which ices sublimate and how the gas drags dust outward. The mass flow depends on how much surface has woken and how deep the heat has reached. Multiply and you get a force. Divide by the nucleus mass and you get an acceleration, an extra beat per bar. If the mass is large, the beat is inaudible. If the taps are symmetric, the beats cancel. Either way, the staff stays clean. There's music in the jets themselves. Some comets carry a single bright vent that rotates into day like a soloist, raising and lowering intensity in a steady tremolo as the body turns. Others carry several faint sources that overlap, their swells and fades smearing into a pad of sound that feels constant, even though it's stitched from many hands. When observers report a sun-facing gleam that later gives way to a more assertive anti-solar tail, part of that shift can be the mix changing. One section of the orchestra rests, while another, warmer section comes in with a slightly different tone. The ear notices the blend first. Only later does the mind name the instruments. I keep an eye on the residual plots while I listen. They look like quiet audio meters, little bars that should hover around zero when the model is breathing along with the sky. If a non-gravitational force enters with confidence, the meters lean in one direction and stay there. They don't tonight. They flutter a little, as all meters do. They drift and return, as all drifts do. But they refuse to form a melody of their own, and that refusal is a form of truth. The jets exist. We see their dust by reflected sunlight. We see their gas where lines brighten. But the total push does not step out of the room's low hum. You might ask how a forward gleam could coexist with such quiet meters. The answer is that brightness is about scattering and concentration, not only about force. Small grains can glow forward like a choir facing the lamp, and the choir can sound loud because of acoustics rather than because the stage moved. Meanwhile, larger grains and gas tails can settle into the familiar anti-solar direction without adding much to the drum's displacement, especially if equal choirs are warming on opposite sides of the stage as the day rotates. The ear hears timbre changes before it hears a shift in tempo. If there were a different kind of music here, controlled burns, intentional thrusting, you would expect crisp accents out of time with the sun's steady beat. the residual meters would step and hold. The rhythm would show staccato events that ignore where noon and night fall on the surface. Spectra might reveal odd notes, materials that don't belong in a frozen mix, lines that ring like metal rather than vapor. That is not tonight's recording. The track we have is a soft ostinato, repeating, evolving in tone as the instrument warms, but loyal to gravity's downbeat. I like to think of rotation phase as a drum circle the sun leads. Each active patch is a player who joins when the light reaches them, adds a tap or a roll, and rests when shadow returns. If 4 players sit roughly evenly around the rim, their taps cancel in motion even as they fill the air with texture. If one player is louder than the others, a little sway creeps into the group, and we log it with the small alphabet of coefficients that future listeners will understand. When the group is large and balanced, the sway disappears into the swell, and we call that good sleep music because nothing in it jars the body into attention, and nothing in it insists on being resolved before the hour ends. There is a long sentence I keep for myself when the monitors are steady and the sky is generous, and it runs like this. Even where propulsion is present, it is not always a story about travel. Sometimes it is a story about texture, about the way countless tiny departures can fill the halo with sound while leaving the path unmoved. And in that understanding is the quiet relief that we are allowed to listen without inventing a soloist where none is playing. Allowed to map the percussion without accusing the drum of walking off its stand. Allowed to rest in the knowledge that sunlight, rotation, and ice can compose a complete piece that is both intricate and kind. The dome breathes. An instrument light dims across the room. Outside, wind leans on the panels in a low, even note that seems to come from everywhere at once. In my head, the comet's jets keep their soft pattern, a steady brushing and release, and the path through the dark holds its pitch as if tuned by a generous ear. The image on the screen settles, and the sound in the room folds into a single layer of gentle noise, like distant surf you only notice, because the instant it stops you miss it. And so, I leave the frame on that quiet. I start with one small figure, held close like a smooth stone from the shore. It stands for how much material leaves the surface in a second, a tiny stream you could almost picture trickling between fingertips. The number is modest, but it matters, because every bit that drifts away pushes back on the body, and the body answers, as any vessel does, by shifting, however slightly, against the water around it. Another small figure joins the first, a speed for the leaving flow. Gas slips off quicker than dust, a light spray compared to a handful of sand. Multiply the two, and you have a force, as if wind were catching a scrap of sail. Divide that force by the weight of the hull, and you know how much the course should bend. These are pocketable numbers, honest and portable. I turn them over, feel their edges, and then look up from the palm to the wider chart. Wider, the coast appears, measured positions on many nights, each a pin pushed into the map where gravity says the track should pass. If outgassing plays the wind with any strength, the pins drift in a preferred direction. Navigators write in a correction, the way a captain might allow for a cross current. With this traveller, the pins hew close to the plotted line. Whatever breezes the jets raise, the keel does not yaw much, and that teaches a quiet lesson about the hull beneath. Two plain outcomes fit the chart. Either the ship is heavy enough that gusts of gas barely move it, or the sails are trimmed on opposite rails so their pulls cancel. Neither outcome is romantic. Both are kind. A heavier nucleus is simply a larger, more consolidated piece of ancient stuff. Its density likely in the familiar range we've seen before. Its volume enough to swallow the little pushes without complaint. A balanced pattern of vents is simply a matter of many small flags catching daylight around the rim, their tugs evening out over a turn. Closer in again, I roll that first stone of a figure against another. Densities we have measured from past visitors, often in the neighborhood of 0.5 gram per cubic centimeter, foam-light compared to rock, but substantial in bulk. I add a memory of measured speeds, gas leaving at a few hundred meters per second near the sun, dust following more slowly. These are not exotic winds. They are the trades, steady and predictable. When you build a back-of-the-envelope ship from those pieces and set it under such a breeze, the correction you'd expect to scribble into the log is small. The chart agrees. There are caveats, and each has its own grain. Dust can be thrown preferentially along certain headings, narrow jets instead of a gentle spray. Gas-to-dust ratios can shift with depth and day. Grains can grow larger or break finer, changing how they answer sunlight's push. In one scenario, the vessel feels a little more lee. In another, it steadies. None of these turn a skiff into a clipper overnight. When residuals stay near the plotted track, the simplest reading is that the ballast is sufficient, and the sails, while busy, sum to near calm. If you wanted numbers to bully you into drama, you could make them try. Assume all the flow is gas at the fastest speeds, all blown through a single nozzle fixed on one rail, all day, every day. The acceleration would still have to survive rotation and persist across changes in heat and geometry. It would have to show up as a steady set of offsets in the positions we measure from night to night. It hasn't. The log reads like a week of smooth water, with only the usual ripples from seeing, timing, and instrument mood. This is where method steadies the deck. We don't ask one snapshot to carry the voyage. We run many combinations of reasonable inputs, grains this big or that, vents here or there, gas of this or that vigor, and see how often the modeled sway exceeds what the sky allows. The distribution that comes back is broad enough to be honest, and peaked enough to be useful. Most roads lead to a hull that either weighs more than a small family comet, or carries its flags in a way that their pulls largely cancel. Even without writing an exact displacement on the manifest, the conclusion keeps the compass calm. A larger hull is not surprising for a traveller from far away. Time between stars is as rough as open ocean. Erosion is relentless at the surface. Volatile cargo is safest deeper in the hold. Objects that arrive with enough ballast to still carry ice can be substantial, and substantial bodies answer squalls with little change of heading. When we watched a different visitor up close, an irregular craft shaped like a battered rubber duck, we learned how low density bulk and broad dimensions can still yield a resilient, stubbornly steady drift under solar weather. This one appears to share that stubbornness. In the second half of the watch, I step out of the calculus and let the room work like a quiet harbour. The monitors dim to a dusky blue, numbers ticking like slow buoys. The dome's edge hums as if a breakwater were taking the push of a patient tide, Somewhere a relay clicks with the dry confidence of a mast fitting settling in its collar. No new facts arrive. Only the sense of a vessel that has found its trim, moving on a wide, predictable swell, its wake a long, pale ribbon lying behind it, so gently you'd miss it if the moonlight didn't outline the edge. Across the final stretch, a long breath fits the argument together. Estimates of flow and speed give you a soft force. Dividing by a plausible mass leaves you with an acceleration often below the reach of night-to-night astrometry. Spreading vents around a spinning shape reduces net push further. And because all these parts are either observed elsewhere or grounded in easy physics, the most restful read is that big things bend little under small, balanced winds, and that this is exactly what our pins in the chart have been saying all along as they fall. One by one, near where gravity draws the line, refusing to compose a new current where the old one carries well enough for now. When the next set of positions posts, we'll weigh them with the same care, fit a line, check the leftover drifts, and keep the tally of how firmly the keel holds as the sun warms and cools the decks in turn. And if the first breath from a cold surface is carbon dioxide, then the earliest haze rises fast and fine. If later breaths are mostly water, then the haze grows heavier, slower, more inclined to drift the way sunlight pushes it. If both are true in sequence, the scene can change without drama, the way fog gathers at dawn, and then settles as the day warms. I keep the picture in that gentle register. Early on, far from the sun's stronger warmth, the lighter ice is the quick speaker. Carbon dioxide lets go at lower temperatures, lifting tiny grains that scatter forward, a bright mist that seems to lean toward the lamp. The effect is not rebellion, only optics and timing. Small particles favor the light's direction. Their lives are brief. They glow like dew when you stand in the right place. Closer in, a slower constituency wakes. Water prefers more heat. It answers later, and when it does, it brings along sturdier companions, larger, darker grains that do not fling themselves as readily into the forward gleam. They drift outward and fall in line with radiation's push, turning the display toward the classic shape we expect. A stream that thins away from the sun like veil-thin weather carried on a steady breath. The forward sparkle softens. The anti-solar plume takes the stage, and the change reads as a season, not a switch. This compositional handoff can happen across a modest stretch of space. A moving surface meets new sunlight each day. The thermal wave walks inward. Different layers answer in turn. Shallow pockets rich in volatile CO2 spend themselves first, leaving behind a crust that requires deeper warmth before it loosens. When the front reaches water-dominated zones, the mix shifts, and the mist we see acquires a different grain, a different patience, a different way of yielding to the outward shove. Nothing here insists on speed. The sky likes unhurried transitions. Rotation speaks softly in this language. A waking patch that once faced morning might cool as the body turns, while another region catches noon. The sum of those thin breaths sets the direction of freshest mist at any given hour. Spread around the rim, they average toward calm. Clustered, they can favor a side. Over weeks, the pattern we record is what survives rotation and light together, and that is why the forward gleam can wane, while the outward plume thickens, without any need for surprise. Spectra are the senses we trust when shapes tempt us into story. Lines of certain gases rise and fall with distance from the sun. Water's fingerprints strengthen as heat deepens. Carbon dioxide's voice can dominate earlier, whispering in bands outside human sight. If, across the same months when the pictures change, we hear that the tonal exchange, CO₂ easing, H₂O swelling, the mist story holds with more grace. If dust-to-gas ratios alter as well, if larger grains become common while the forward spark dims, the reading becomes kinder still. But even without that perfect choir of measurements, the physics rests on small, familiar steps. Sublimation is simply solids turning directly to gas when warmed. Gas entrains dust by collision and drag, and the sizes that most easily follow set the dominant look of the coma's light. Fine grains behave like bright, brief fog lit from the front. Coarser grains carry mass but scatter less. They extend the plume like a trailing veil, more honest to radiation's outward nudge. Between those regimes sits the scene you and I have been watching. An early, delicate forward veil giving way to a steadier outward stream. The transition can feel abrupt in a notebook because observation nights are uneven. Clouds visited one week, a scheduling gap opened in another. The angle changed while we slept. Stitch the frames together and the mist's mood can look like it flipped. Sit with the calendar though, and the arc softens. Each added night brings context, and context is the cure for stories that want to run too fast. A measured fade in one direction and a measured rise in the other is the kind of patience nature repeats across many small systems that breathe. Glaciers carving with the season, geysers finding regularity once pressure cycles, even morning fog that lingers longer in a valley than on a ridge. There is one long, quiet sentence worth holding near the end of the watch, and it goes like this. Given what we know about how different ices answer heat, given how small grains favour forward scattering while larger ones answer radiation pressure more faithfully, and given how rotation and viewing angles play gently with both, a weeks-long easing of a sunward sheen alongside a strengthening anti-solar plume is exactly the kind of weather such a surface could host as it moves inward, requiring no flourish beyond layered ice, changing grain, and the slow kindness of warming. Tests remain, because tests bring sleep. Polarization can reveal grain sizes, like the sheen on mist tells whether the droplets are fine or fat. Infrared lines can weigh the competing volatiles in the breath. High cadence images can show whether a fresh patch wakes and sleeps on a rotation, the way a fog bank thickens and thins with a tide-like regularity. Each measurement is a window onto the same quiet room, making it easier to trust that the air in here is only air, that the haze is honest, and that light and heat are enough to paint the whole scene. Some will ask for a stranger fog, an engineered exhale timed to perihelion, a choreography that mimics seasons while ignoring them underneath. It is fair to note the standard for such a tale. The breath would need to persist in ways the sun's rhythm cannot explain, cut in and out on offbeats, or carry traces in spectrum that do not belong to any known ice or dust. Those signs have not taken the floor. What we have is a steady air that shifts character as warmth deepens, a scene no more scandalous than an autumn morning learning to be noon. In the small hours, this is the comfort I keep. Even complicated mist obeys simple terms, and the sky likes to change by steps, not by leaps. The forward sheen thins because the droplets change. The outward plume grows because the droplets drift. And when the season asks both to continue, they do, in balance, until new warmth retires the old breath entirely. That is enough for tonight. Let me set 3 handrails where your eyes can rest. First, the beta number, a simple ratio between sunlight's push and the sun's pull. Second, grain size. Tiny specks answer light more readily than large ones. Third, viewing angle. Where we stand changes what brightness prefers. With those held in your palm, the picture steadies. Beta behaves kindly. For submicron dust, beta can be large enough that light pressure competes with gravity, and the grain streams outward with enthusiasm. For millimeter dust, beta is small, and gravity keeps its hand on the shoulder. This is why some strands shoot straight anti-solar, and others cling close, why a broad fan can hide a slower, heavier drift. The math behind it is compact, as if light itself were a quiet, constant breeze. Grain size is the practical half of that story. Small grains scatter light efficiently and brighten at certain angles, especially when the Sun-Comet-Earth angle is small. Large grains reflect less per unit mass and last longer in sunlight, constructing trails that curl along the orbit like faint chalk. Change the size mix and you change the look. No drama required. Angle is the third handrail, and it is gentle. Stand near the forward line and tiny grains glow toward you. Step away and the sparkle dims, leaving the classical tail to dominate. Cross the orbital plane, and dust already laid down along that plane can project as a sunward spike. None of this needs defiance. It needs patience with geometry. Now, hold those 3 together and walk back to the visitor. Early in the approach, small grains can dominate, favoured by the earliest active ices and by forward scattering that lifts the sunward brightness. Weeks pass. The distance to the sun shrinks. Larger grains become more common, liberated by deeper warming or by different patches turning on, and the anti-solar fan grows wider because large grains heed the outward push more honestly. The forward glow softens because you and I are no longer standing in the best light for it. Modelers have tidy tools for this. Synchrone's track when dust was released. Syndyne's track beta. How strongly light pushes a given size. Lay those curves across an image, and patterns that felt mysterious often fall into place. The way a line of starlings looks like a cloud, until you mark the flight paths. If the radiance sits where the synchrone map says last month's release should lie, the story is dust and time. If it clings to a direction that refuses the map, we ask for more tests. Polarization adds a quiet test tone. Dust scatters polarized light in ways that depend on size, shape, and angle. Measure polarization over a few nights, and you can tell whether the coma has shifted from fine grains to coarser ones, even if the brightness alone could be read 2 ways. A rising polarization at certain phase angles hints that the grain population is changing. A flat response suggests the mix stayed steady and geometry did the work. Both outcomes are friendly to sleep. There's another kindness here. Grain lifetime under sunlight depends on composition and size. Ice-rich specks sublimate swiftly, bright for a short span. Refractory crumbs endure, duller but persistent. If a sunward spritz relied on brief-lived fine grains, the feature can fade by chemistry alone, even before geometry finishes its lesson. The longer low-beta trail remains, written by stubborn grains that outlast the sparkle. In a sequence of images that looks like intention, but reads as materials science. You might wonder what speed has to do with it. Not much, until it does. Ejection speed sets how far from the nucleus a given size will show itself before light pressure redirects the path. Small grains leave fast, paint close-in textures, and then depart. Large grains leave slower and build the broader canvas. If a nucleus rotates, the spray revolves, and on timescales of hours, the inner coma modulates like a slow lantern turning in a steady room. Across weeks, the average picture is smoother, shaped mainly by beta and angle, not by momentary gusts. Here is one long, unbroken idea to rest inside. When we see a forward shimmer give way to a more obedient outward plume, we are likely witnessing a compound of shifting beta distribution, evolving release sites, and changing phase angle, so that the early dominance of high beta, forward bright grains, yields gently to the sturdier presence of low beta dust, whose paths align with radiation pressure, while the underlying orbit, ruled by gravity, changes not at all in character, and the only accents left for us to count are the soft ones close to the core, where rotation breathes through the jets as night follows day. Edge cases remain, and they're worth keeping on the tray. If a narrow, sunward beam persists through large phase angle changes, if polarization refuses the curves, or if the synchrone Sindine net cannot catch the feature without gymnastics, then geometry is no longer a sufficient pillow. We would ask different questions, but most nights the net fits with room to spare. Most nights light behaves like light, dust like dust, and angles like the courteous stage directions they are. In that spirit, I keep our 3 handrails in reach. Beta tells me which grains the light can shepherd. Size tells me who brightens and who lingers. Angle tells me where the glow prefers to meet us. When those agree with what the frames show, I feel the picture settle, like a lamp turned low in a familiar room. And at that threshold, where the figure and the light meet, I pause without stepping through, hand resting on the frame. A thin green thread runs through the dark tonight. Not the literal emerald of oxygen emission, but a quiet guide in the mind, a hue to follow as we ask a careful question. If this visitor were more than ice and dust, what color of evidence would it paint? First, I hold the green line steady and look at motion. Gravity writes a clean track. Natural jets add faint swirls that follow sunlight and rotation. An artificial hand would lay down a different tint, sustained non-gravitational acceleration that does not care about phase angle or day-night on the surface, a push that keeps its shade no matter how the light moves. We would see residuals march in one direction and refuse to fade when geometry changes. Next, I imagine sudden strokes. Comets breathe on a schedule the sun conducts. A maneuverer would add discrete pulses, short bright bands cut into the timeline, position shifts that begin and end sharply, not with the slow gradient of warming, but with on-off edges that look like painted bars across an otherwise soft wash. The green thread would snag on those edges because they are hard against the page. Direction is its own palette. Natural jet axes precess with rotation and illumination. Reorientations repeat with the spin, as predictable as a hand turning a page. If jet direction changed to new headings that did not match the body's turn or the lamp's angle, if the brush kept stroking a fresh direction through many rotations, we would circle that region in a brighter color and ask why it stays so fixed. Composition adds contrast. Spectra from comae are full of familiar tones: water, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, simple organics, dust continua. A genuinely engineered plume might carry lines we do not expect in a frozen mix, features that sit like saturated bands where the natural palette is usually pale. A metal line at strength, a peculiar ratio among volatiles, a thermal signature too warm for sunlight alone, any of these would push our green guide brighter. Signals beyond light are part of the gallery. Narrowband radio tones, repeating modulation patterns, or radar reflections with specular hard facets could mark surfaces or systems unlike any we've met. Silence is the default color of space. If sound appears on a single clean frequency, held and then shaped, it stands out like a vivid stripe on grey canvas. We would check and then check again with independent ears. Even the path itself can look curated. Interstellar visitors arrive on many angles and speeds. A trajectory that threads unusually close passes. Sun, then planet, then another asset, could feel conspicuously arranged. But statistics are still a young sketch here. With only a few examples in the frame, I am slow to call a careful line deliberate. The green thread reminds me to separate taste from proof. Verification is a discipline of color matching. One observatory's claim is a single swatch. We need a palette from many. Independent teams, different instruments, varied wavelengths, cross-checked reductions. The agreement must be broad and deep. In practice, that means astrometry across months, spectroscopy in both optical and infrared, sensitive radio listening, polarimetry to weigh grains, and a confidence level high enough that noise hides in the margins. The final canvas should look the same no matter which light you hang it under. I also hold the null against the light. Most strange shades fade with better exposure. Anti-tails soften when phase angle moves. Forward gleams dim as grain sizes change. Residuals flatten when rotation is modeled with care. A high bar is not a fence against wonder. It is a way to keep bright paint for the few strokes that deserve it. If a claim survives geometry, persists through rotation, resists new calibrations, and repeats across instruments, the remaining color is strong enough to study without hurry. There is a gentle economy in how we proceed. We set tests beforehand, not afterward. We say which hues would count and which are artifacts of the studio. We avoid decorating noise with meaning. And we agree to leave the canvas ordinary unless the pattern keeps returning in the same tint, in the same corner, even as the lamps move and the easels change. This protects us from bright mistakes and preserves our attention for the real patches of unfamiliar color. Near the end of the watch, I let a single long thought run, a wash from one edge of the page to the other. If the object were artificial, we would expect a geometry-independent push that persists through phase changes, discrete position steps that resemble burns rather than warming, jet axes that lock to directions unrelated to the body's spin or the sun's illumination, spectral bands that don't belong to primitive ice and dust, perhaps a narrow radio line or a radar glint that implies hard, engineered surfaces. And we would demand that each of these features be seen by more than one team, with more than one tool, until the colors match across the whole field so well that even skeptics can trace the same bright line with their eyes closed. Tonight, the greens are softer. The tail learns the lamp. The spectra sit in expected families. The path agrees with gravity, within the muddle that every measurement carries. That does not end the question. It only paints the current state with quiet honesty. We keep the brushes clean. we keep looking, and we let the thin green thread we started with return, unforced, to guide the eye back along the edge of the halo, where the colour is palest and truest, a reminder that patient light makes its own case, and that restraint reads better in the dark than any sudden stripe we might be tempted to add. We take this slowly, like a quiet walk along a path that bends toward light. One step is an hour before dawn, when the sky is still a deep slate and the air is steady. The next step is just after dusk, when the horizon holds the last pale band and the visitor rises into a window between safety and glare. We don't rush, we mark each step and keep our breathing even. Perihelion is where the trail narrows. Heat higher, stress is greater, and activity often swells. Yet our view must keep a respectful distance. Telescopes have rules about the sun. Keep out angles that act like fences along the path. Space observatories obey them strictly. Ground instruments respect them with common sense and careful scheduling. So we plan our walk around twilight, catching the object when elongation is large enough for comfort and altitude is kind enough for clarity. Between these steps, the world turns. A few degrees of spin change the air, change the seeing, change the exact hue of the sky. We accept this as part of the walk. Early frames near perihelion can show fresh jets waking, a halo brightening, a tail stretching as if it remembered how to be long. Later frames can catch the aftermath, cooling, settling, perhaps small fragments if the path was too steep. The walk does not guarantee drama. It offers a chance to be present if drama chooses to arrive. On the path itself, we use simple waypoints. Solar elongation tells us whether the angle is safe enough for a glance. Air mass reminds us how thick a slice of atmosphere we're peering through. Phase angle hints at what brightness prefers, forward scattered sparkle, or the calmer glow of a tail turned outward. Each waypoint feels ordinary, but in combination they mark the hours that matter most, the ones where a small change can finally be seen without strain. Perihelion has a rhythm of its own. Activity often crests, not in a spike, but in a rounded wave, with thermal lag nudging the peak after the closest pass. That means our most telling steps may fall in the days just beyond the bend, when heat has soaked into layers slow to wake and jets answer with patience rather than haste. A rushed glance can miss what a lingering stroll will catch. There are blind corners on this path. Conjunction periods hide the traveller behind daylight, even when it's geometrically close. The walk pauses then. Radios hiss more. Optical instruments rest. We return when the path opens again, accepting that some turns happen out of sight, and that the story is still readable without every letter. Knowing where the path narrows and when it opens keeps the pace restful. Safety shapes our choices. Space telescopes hold to strict avoidance zones near the sun. They cannot peer into the glare, even when our curiosity wants to. Ground observers aim low only when conditions allow, preferring higher steps on the path where the air is kinder. None of this is caution for caution's sake. It is simply how a good walk avoids loose scree and keeps ankles unturned. Hours near perihelion matter for diagnosis as well as display. If outgassing truly flips emphasis from one set of vents to another, or from one volatile to the next, the change will write itself into both morphology and spectrum around this bend. If non-gravitational tugs are present at all, they are likeliest to show themselves here, when mass loss crests and any imbalance has the best chance to speak above noise. That invites a deliberate cadence. Measure, rest, measure again, and let small residuals prove they belong by repeating. Even without fireworks, the post-perihelion walk can be rich. Dust lingers, gas quiets, patterns relax into shapes easier to read against a dimmer sky. Night by night, the path away from the sun lets the halo thin and the tail unwind, and in those calmer frames we can test whether the long arc kept to gravity's line, whether jets mapped to rotation as expected, whether the forward gleam's earlier confidence was a matter of angle and grain rather than an argument with the lamp. I try to hold a long, unbroken pace through this part of the night, counting steps in a way that becomes its own comfort. The hour before twilight, when elongation, phase, and altitude align. The check on keep-out limits so no instrument strays. The patient spacing of exposures to catch rotation without losing the broader changes. The quiet acceptance that fragmentation, if it comes, will look like a soft unspooling rather than an explosion, and that the most valuable measure we may carry home is not spectacle, but the clean agreement between ephemeris and sky, after everything has been warmed, stressed, and allowed to breathe again, under the narrowing and then widening of this careful path, we're sharing with a body older than our maps and more patient than our clocks. At the end of the walk, the trail lifts gently into a darker stretch. We check our notes. The hours we circled are behind us, but echoes of those hours remain in the frames we kept and the positions we logged. The bend is past, the way ahead is longer, and the pace we set here will carry us outward through cooler nights where conclusions are less tempting and attention is easier to hold. If the next window opens just so, what will the light show us then? I want to write to you directly for a minute, just you and me under the same faint dome of light. Tonight's work is not a single telescope hero shot. It's a quiet chorus, a village of lamps answering one another across distance, each adding a careful lumen to the page. We begin with a small lamp on a hill, someone's backyard rig sending precise positions to the clearinghouse where such lights are gathered, and from there larger lamps take their cues. The scene brightens almost imperceptibly, like dawn that decides to be patient. When a new frame hints at change, an alert goes out, not with fanfare, but with coordinates and times. The message is simple. Here is where the light has shifted. Here is when it will be kind to look again. Survey telescopes sweep broad beams and mark the moving glow. The minor planet center braids those measures into an orbit you can trust. Ephemerides spin out future waypoints, so the next lamps can find their focus without guessing. The choreography isn't loud because it doesn't need to be. It's a chain of small illuminations, each allowing the next. Spectroscopists switch on narrower lamps, tuned to particular hues. They sit with the glow and split it gently, asking what gases are singing and what dust is merely reflecting the room. Polarimeters add a soft sheen to the record, telling whether the grains are fine, like fog, or coarse, like ash. Radio dishes listen in the dark for any narrow line that would glitter against the usual noise. Even if most nights return only quiet, knowing that quiet was confirmed across lamps is a comfort, the kind that stays. Space observatories keep their protective halos, bright safety cones around the sun they will not break. When the geometry agrees, those instruments lift their shutters and pour steadier, colder light on the same visitor. Infrared spectra slide into place beside the optical ones, and a broader palette emerges. No part needs to shout. You can think of it as lanterns along a river path. White, then amber, then a cool blue, all tracing the same bend in the water, each revealing a little more of the curve. Coordination is a kindness to the mind as much as to the data. A survey's wide lamp is good at noticing that something has changed. A big mirror's lamp is good at telling what that something is. A patient astrometrist's lamp is good at proving the path still honours gravity's line. When those beams overlap, when the same outline appears in each pool of light, anxiety drops its shoulders. You feel it even through headphones, the sense that many eyes have agreed on the same few stars, and that the visitor sits among them where it should. On nights like this, we also practice economy of light. Director's time and rapid response slots are finite. We spend them when an object asks questions that broad lamps cannot answer. Perihelion weeks earn that attention. Closest Earth approach earns a little, too. But much of the story is told by modest lamps used well. Community telescopes threading short exposures through twilight. Mid-size mirrors catching rotation phases between clouds. Observers in different longitudes handing the object off like a candle that shouldn't be allowed to go out. What counts as proof looks different under many lamps. And that is the point. If there is an extra shove on the path, it will appear not only as a faint drift in positions, but as a change in the morphology that survives angle, and as a small mismatch between predicted and measured timing that repeats when the geometry resets. If there is unusual chemistry, it will not be a single bright line in a single spectrum, but the same odd hue confirmed by another instrument on another night, at another temperature, after another calibration. And once you've seen that happen a few times, from white light to amber to blue, each lamp tracing the same detail, the brain relaxes into trust, the way pupils relax when a room finds the right dimmer setting. I won't pretend it's always smooth. Weather puts a thumb on one lamp, scheduling on another. An alert goes out a few hours late because someone thought it kinder to check twice. A detector runs warmer than planned, and a hue drifts slightly. But redundancy is built into the constellation. Where one light flickers, another steadies. This is why we keep global networks, why longitudes share their night, why southern and northern eyes learn each other's routes through the dark. The result is not perfection, it is resilience, and resilience is what lets a gentle truth accumulate without fuss. You matter in this circuit as well, not as a hype machine, but as part of the patient beam. When you ask for sources, you're asking where the lamps are and how they're aimed. When you give us time to compare light measured in different ways, you're giving us the long exposure that turns noise into signal. Across weeks, those courtesies add up to the kind of clarity you can rest in. The visitor's path is where gravity says. The forward gleam gave way to the outward plume as angles and grains changed. The spectra sit within the families we expect, even as we keep the lamps ready for anything brighter than that calm. There is a long, soft sentence I send to you now, the way one might send a picture of a dark city from an airplane window, where the grid of lamps makes a story without a single bulb trying to carry it alone. Surveys sweep and announce. The clearinghouse fits an orbit, Mid-sized mirrors test morphology and hue. Large telescopes take deeper spectra when the sky allows. Radio dishes listen for anything narrow, and the repeatability of the same outline in all these pools of light becomes the quiet proof that we are seeing the same thing with many instruments, which is the most respectful way to decide whether something is ordinary or rare, and the best recipe I know for sleep. You can let your shoulders drop here. The sky does too. The lab is hushed and friendly at this hour. A red LED keeps time on the power strip. The kettle ticks softly on its plate. A faint blue from the screens paints the notepad with thin rectangles of night. We've been here together for a while, you and I, letting instruments and patience share the same desk. On the whiteboard, I've left the same 3 anchors we've carried across the night. Light pushes dust, geometry edits appearances, and many measurements agree better than one. They are not slogans, they are habits. In a night shift room, habits keep the work warm. They ask us to write what we know in pencil, confirm the line, and trace it again only if it returns. I page back through the notebook. Early frames showed a forward sheen, a tidy brightening on the sunward side when phase and grain size conspired to favour that direction. Later frames traded that sheen for a more classical plume, leaning away, longer and calmer. Between those entries are small arrows noting rotation, small stars marking changes of angle, and the relaxed circles I draw when astrometric residuals sit near zero. The pages don't argue, they accumulate. On the bench, a spectrograph lamp cools. The spectrum we took tonight sits where it should. Lines for familiar gases, dust continuum as expected, no sharp strangers. In another window, a polar plot waits for its final labels, a tidy curve that reads like grain sizes we've met before. The lab is not surprised. It is relieved. Most science nights end this way, with quiet confirmations that the world keeps its rules even while it makes new pictures. The best lesson to carry out of a room like this is that doubt can be kind. Doubt that asks for one more check. Doubt that separates folds from seams. Doubt that knows how often a forward gleam is a matter of angle and grain rather than a quarrel with the sun. In a night shift lab, kindness and rigour are not opposites. They are adjacent shelves that share the same light. We talked earlier about what would count as a stranger story. Discrete steps in position that look like burns, not warming. A thrust that persists through phase changes and rotation, hold in a heading the sun didn't ask for. Spectra with lines out of family. A narrow radio tone that returns when called from more than one dish. None of those took the floor tonight. The boards show familiar chalk. The frames show ordinary grace. And ordinary here is not a dismissal. It is a word for how nature's quiet patterns make sleep possible. Out the slit, the dome shares a thin band of stars, the sort that always look cooler than the room even when the air is dry. I think of how many lamps it took to learn what we learned, the survey tiles, the astrometry handoffs, the small telescopes that fill gaps, the large mirrors that split light fine. A night like this is never a single hero image. It's a ledger of small, practiced acts that together decide a question gently. I leave a note on the whiteboard for the day team, a sentence that will make sense even before coffee. Forward sparkle eased, with phase and grain. Anti-solar plume strengthened, residuals flat within noise. Spectra in family. Continue cadence post-perihelion when the view widens. Notes like this are promises to our future selves. They say, keep doing the simple things well, and the larger picture will stay steady under your hands. Somewhere in the second half of a night, fatigue invites grand conclusions. This is when I pull the chair a little closer to the desk, breathe, and let the long sentence form the way an exposure forms on a quiet detector. If we accept that light pressure sorts dust by size, that viewing angle brightens or dims the forward side without malice, that rotation turns jets in and out of day, and that repeated measurements made by different instruments reduce error to a manageable hum, then a sequence that moves from sunward gleam to outward plume, while the orbit remains guided by gravity, is neither scandal nor surprise, but the generous behavior of an object warming by steps in a solar system where patience beats noise, and many eyes together are wiser than any one. I set the pens parallel to the edge of the pad. The kettle clicks once and sleeps. The fans keep their low, contented breath. If there is a final lesson for the walk home, it is that restraint helps us see more, not less. We keep curiosity bright and claims dim until the light insists. We let humility do its quiet work of keeping options open without letting chaos in. We trust the difference between fascination and certainty, because both are needed and each knows when to lead. In the log, I write a last line for this watch. Patience gathered 2 frames into one story. Tests separated appearance from change. Community turned flickers into a curve. And the sky, older than any lab, rewarded attention with a pattern we can carry forward without losing rest. I cap the pen, and the red LED keeps time for both of us as the screen's blue thins, and the door catches only as much air as a careful hand allows when it closes. I'm going to set the room gently tonight now. We watched a visitor change in patient steps, from a forward gleam caught at the right angle to a calmer tail leaning away from the sun. We kept the 2 frames together in memory and let the weeks between them do their honest work. Light pushed dust as it always does. Gas traced its cleaner line. Phase angle favoured a sunward sparkle early, then backed away and let the anti-solar plume speak more clearly. Across that span, positions on the sky held to gravity's path within the usual noise. No persistent extra push insisted on a different story. Spectra stayed in family: water, carbon dioxide, ordinary dust, shifting in emphasis the way warming layers do as an object moves inward. We used quiet tools, overlays for sun and motion, synchrones and syndynes to map dust age and size, polarization to weigh grains, astrometry to check whether the track obeyed the ephemeris. When the geometry changed, appearances changed with it. When rotation brought new surface patches into light, brightness near the core adjusted. The pattern was consistent with known behavior, and that consistency let the mind rest. Perihelion came as a narrow window rather than a spectacle. Observing rules kept our instruments safe. Twilight frames and careful timing filled gaps. Afterward, the same slow measures continued, because the best answers in this kind of work arrive from overlap. Many eyes, many nights, the same outline repeating, until even the stray doubts grow quiet. Thank you for staying with me through the soft steps. Your attention helped turn flickers into a curve. If your eyelids feel heavy now, that's a good sign. It means the sky behaved, and our notes were enough. Let the last detail drift where it wants to. Let the tail thin to a line, and the halo fold into the dark. Breathe once more with the rhythm of Steady instruments, sleep well.